Signs, signs, everywhere is sign, cluttering up the scenery and breaking my mind. Do this, don't do that, can't you read the novel writing signs? There are, of course, plenty of signs that you've written a novel that doesn't live up to expectations. Today, we're going to talk about 5 signs of a bad novel and what you can do about them. And I'm sorry that that song is now stuck in your head. All right, sign number 1 that you've written a bad novel, the direction of the story is unclear to the reader. I talk about this so much that you probably predicted that this video was going to go in that direction, but predictable stories are often better than unpredictable ones, provided they are predictable in the right way. Now, predictable is an incredibly nuanced term here that bears some explanation. Anytime a reader starts reading a novel, they're going to ask themselves questions like, what direction is this story going in? What kind of events are going to play out? What sort of novel is this? Whether they do this consciously or unconsciously, the reader at the first part of the novel is trying to decide if this story is for them, if it's something that they want to continue reading. Part of what you need to do, especially early on in your novel, is provide that direction to the reader. Are we answering the questions of a mystery? Are we watching a romantic relationship develop? Are we following vertically challenged characters on a trip to return a piece of jewelry? The general direction of your story needs to be clear to the reader as early on as possible. This will help establish in their minds whether this is a novel that they want to spend time with. Novels that don't answer and deliver on that question are hard to connect with and are more difficult for the reader to become invested in. The reader needs some idea of focus, some idea of direction. Now, how the novel gets to where it's going, this is where surprises and twists and intrigue and escalation come in. Giving a clear direction to the reader is not about giving up those elements of your story. In fact, having a clear direction can often enhance things like mystery or intrigue. Sign number 2 of a bad novel, you keep adding tension rather than managing it. Tension is about uncertainty. You give a character a goal, attach some stakes to that goal, and then move them precariously close to success, but equally as close to failure. A high-stakes sports ball game headed to the 5th quarter with our heroic home team trailing by 3 points against the villainous visitors. That's a high-tension situation. There's a lot of uncertainty about whether the heroes are going to triumph. There's a lot of uncertainty about whether they are going to succeed. Tension is great, and any good novel needs to have plenty of it. But simply adding more tension to your novel is not always a good thing. A good novel needs the right amount of tension at the right time, not just more tension. Too much tension starts to drag after a while. Reading high tension scenes is exciting, but also draining. More and more tension will start to become annoying after a while. You do want, generally, a ramping up of tension throughout your novel, but there should be moments of lowered tension along the way. It's not just a straight linear shot of tension from the beginning to the climax of the story. The heartfelt conversations, the moments of deep character reflection, those are all scenes that often require lowered tension in order to work. And those are also scenes that will enhance your novel. Now, some genres like thrillers do keep the story at a high level of tension throughout, but thrillers are generally mainly about tension. Most other genres are about other things besides tension. Tension is like salt. You need to have the right amount of it. Too little or too much is problematic, and often just adding more is not necessarily a good thing. Next up, 3 number sign that novel written bad you aren't letting your story build. Anytime you have some kind of arc or plot sequence in your novel, anytime you are planning to have some kind of payoff later on, you need to focus on building it up. When a novel doesn't work, sometimes it's because stuff just sort of happens without the proper groundwork being laid. You get a bunch of payoffs, but the payoffs sort of come out of nowhere. Relationships between characters move through phases. There's the meet cute, the bump into, that initial tension, the crushing phase, first date, second date, etc., etc. Something like a redemption arc where you have a villain who becomes a hero usually has signs early on that a villain is going to turn, and there's a progression towards that throughout the story. If you have a magic system or some kind of advanced futuristic technology that will solve a big conflict later on in your story, it's usually a good idea to set up the capabilities of that system before the capabilities are used later on. We think about events like a relationship forming or a villain turning to a hero as happening in the moments when those events pay off. But the groundwork for these things needs to be laid much earlier. Good novels lay foundations early on and then very deliberately contrive events to lead to the desired end goal. Do this well and you'll have that surprising yet inevitable moment where the reader didn't see something coming but can now obviously see why they should have expected it all along. This seems kind of obvious, but if you aren't thinking about how various arcs in your novel build up through the course of the story, how you sort of add on to them as events progress, then they may not land well. Abrupt changes happen when you don't craft the build-up in an intentional way. This is how you get unsatisfying endings and unhappy readers and bad novels. Next up, sign number 4 of a bad novel: you give the reader too much, too early. One of the biggest challenges in writing a novel is getting the reader all of the information they need in order to understand and enjoy the story, while also delivering the story in an enjoyable way. Exposition is simultaneously very critical for the reader in order to understand the story, but also kind of the boringest information a lot of the time that the reader needs to deal with. This could be information about the characters, it could be information about the setting, information about events leading up to the start of the story. It's basically any information that's needed to color events of the story that doesn't necessarily naturally occur in the story. I think every genre has this problem, but it probably causes the most headaches for sci-fi and fantasy writers, as those kinds of books often have the steepest learning curve and the largest amount of information that the reader probably isn't familiar with. If your story takes place in a world where cats can talk, have telekinetic abilities, and also run an authoritarian government that oppresses humans and dogs alike, then all of that information needs to get across to the reader because it's information that they're not going to know coming into the story. Now, there's this idea that some writers have that you need to get the reader completely up to speed on your world and your characters and the setting and the history of the plot and all of that before you can actually tell them the story. And that has things kind of backwards. In extreme cases, this leads to things like info dumps or encyclopedia entries at the beginning of a novel, or excessive amounts of awkward explanation, or things like maid and butler dialogue. A whole bunch of problems happen when you try to preload the reader with information before you actually start telling the story. A good novel makes understanding the mechanics of the story part of the story itself. The reader builds and discovers your world as they move through the story in a natural way. The first part of your novel should not be a tutorial on the rest of it. Dumping all of the information up front is easier, but you suck so much energy out of your story later on because the reader has nothing left to discover. And finally, sign number 5 of a bad novel: it lacks balance. This can apply to literally anything in your novel, from big plot-related stuff all the way down to how you're formatting your paragraphs, and even down to how you're formatting your sentences. Writing a good novel is more about doing the right amount of something than just doing more of something. And what your novel needs might be determined by what it currently lacks. How much dialogue should you have? Well, that depends. How much description and action do you have around that dialogue? Are you focusing too much on characters at the expense of plot? Well, that depends. Are you not giving the plot the attention it should have? Does the prose have too much white space, which is going to make the reader move through it too quickly? Or do you have these massive page-long paragraphs that might need to be broken up? Different novels will have different levels of different elements. Some might be very plot-focused, others might be more character-driven. Different writers, too, will have a different balance of elements in their writing. Some might focus a lot on dialogue, others might go into more detail on descriptions. All of this is just variability between novels and your own authorial voice. Problems start to creep in when you have too much of one element and it puts everything else off balance. The problems in your novel could be because you aren't doing enough of something, or it could be that you're doing too much of something. Too much focus on any element, even if it's executed excellently, will cause problems in your novel. You can write great dialogue, but if it leads to white room syndrome or a lack of description and action around that dialogue, it's going to adversely affect your story. This one is tricky because you can do everything in your novel right, but if you're lacking something, if you have an imbalance in the prose or in the plot or with the characters, whatever, then it can ruin the whole thing. If you have a novel that's not working, it could very well be because it's unbalanced. Speaking of unbalanced things, I'm going to balance out the length of this video by ending it now, so it's not too long and unbalanced. That was the worst outro I think I have ever done. Anyway, so there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. I'd love to know what you think about all this stuff in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.